Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor at Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. As you know, each week we share conversations with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, investors, journalists, the ones who are defining how we'll live and work for the next, say, 30 years. Today, we've got an opportunity to learn about one of the hottest areas of automation that we haven't talked about on the show. You may have heard about RPA, or robotic process automation, via high-profile recent IPOs like UiPath's $1.3 billion raise and subsequent $40 billion market cap. There are many approaches to automation, and Indico is one of the leaders in intelligent automation for unstructured documents. Following a recent $22 million Series B raise, they're looking to challenge incumbents while defining a new segment of the market. To date, Indico has raised $36 million from an excellent group of investors, including Jump Capital and Sandbox Ventures, and they've got a team of about 80 people headquartered outside Boston. Transcendent companies aren't born overnight. We know that. Today, we get to hear about the founding vision for Indico and the company's journey to disruption from Slater Victoroff, Indico founder and CTO. There are many patterns for launching and growing an AI-first company. Listen to how Slater discusses the gap in the market and the unique differentiation behind the technology he and the team are building. I'd recommend you pay particular attention to some of the hard decisions that he made to find a seam in a very crowded space of AI for document processing. Expect big things from Slater and from Indico. 8 years in, and he's just getting started. Without further ado, welcome, Slater, to the podcast. Why don't you share a little bit about your background and the founding vision for Indico?
Thank you so much for the wonderful words, Dan. I'll hope to live up to the great intro you've given me. I would really love to say, when you talk about the founding of Indico, this, I'd love to say I sat there in a dorm room, right, and I envisioned what the world was going to look like in 10 years, right, and everything from now, to then has been this carefully calculated chess match, right, and it's all going according to plan, but nothing could really be further from the truth. Frankly, you call this AI first, and I think that is right? I mean, that when you look at the history of Indico, that is really where we started. We were a couple of kids, me and Alec and Madison and Diana, right? Just a very classic dorm room startup. I like to say Indico was founded from the hours of 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. on Sunday nights. And again, it's very true. We were eating pineapple and onion pizza, right? Like very weird, but somehow that's what got the juices flowing. And really what it sprung from was this really this love of deep learning, right? And I actually, what I'll say is that in 2012, I said to a professor of mine, the war is over, deep learning lost, right? And that's kind of, I hold that up as the most wrong I've ever been, right? And that quote is just going to echo out in my mind. I'm never going to be able to forget it. But the thing is, in 2012, that wasn't a particularly weird stance to have, right? Deep learning was kind of this very impractical, unwieldy thing. It's like, what is this even useful for? No one's been able to get it to work. But, right around 2012, 2013, there was a huge sea shift in the space. I was on the wrong side of that. And me and Alec were kind of doing Kaggle competitions for that first 6 months. And, after that first 6 months, my traditional techniques, they just couldn't keep up anymore. Right. And after about 3 months of just losing to these deep learning techniques again and again and again, I was pulling out all of the tricks in my book, right? I was doing novel research just to try to keep pace, and it wasn't working. I'm a very competitive person, so I hate losing. And after, again, a few months of that, I started to get pretty sick. So I switched horses. And when we go back to the very genesis of Indico and we kind of look at that thread that has stayed consistent throughout our lifetime, we love the technology, but when we tried to bring it out to industry and actually make it practical, apply it to the use cases that people cared about, we found that there was this huge gulf in between the academic environment and the enterprise environment. like not all data is created equal. So, just because you've got a million, old copies of invoices sitting in a file cabinet, it doesn't mean you've got an ML strategy. And it doesn't mean you've got the kind of pristine data that you see in these academic situations. So in so many ways, the story of Indico is figuring out how you bridge that gap. The first incarnation of the company, like very, very traditional sort of developer API kind of company. If you look at, the modern, Google or Amazon type offerings, where it's sort of these static black box kind of models, that was Indico V1. Indico V2, we realized that we really weren't bold enough fundamentally, right? Our initial goal was we're going to make static versions of this accessible to developers. Indico V2 is this much, much broader vision, right? Of we're going to make an actual, responsible, transparent, empowering version of this accessible to non-technical business owners. And we'll talk in some more detail about that. But that's sort of the fundamental shift. And when I talk about Indico V2, that's what I mean.
What has surprised you most so far about the entrepreneurial journey?
Oh, I think the answer that any honest entrepreneur will give you is that it's so much harder than they thought, right? And that I just have to say first off, right? One thing that I say, and a lot of my friends say, is that if anyone knew how hard it was when they were starting, no one would ever start. And I think again that's fundamentally true. So just the sheer amount of work, the sheer amount of like pain and difficulty and like blood, sweat, and tears. I thought it was hard. It was harder than I thought. And every time I feel like I've got a handle on how hard it is, it gets harder still, right? I think that's one big thing. I think the other big thing, and this is maybe a little bit of a more recent learning of mine, is that I used to, when I was whatever, when we were in the dorm room, we raised our initial money from Rough Draft, it was 20K, which they call, pizza money. And we literally spent that on pizza, right? I would look at these people raising, $22 million like we did, right? And be like, oh, wow, that company's so successful. If I had that amount of money, I could do anything, the moon would be the limit. Those folks have really made it. And I absolutely don't feel that way. Right. Not even like, and what I've realized is that kind of feeling of discomfort, right? That feeling where you don't feel like you've got enough resources, right? Where you've got to make these really, really difficult decisions, where you feel completely constrained, that never goes away, right? Really what changes, it's not like you're executing against the same vision with more money, right? It's no, your vision grows to match the promise of your company. Right. And, I had a really great conversation with a mentor of mine where I was kind of espousing this. I'm like, oh, my goodness, like I thought this was going to, and I mean, granted, we can do a lot more than we could before we got this money. Right. But I said, I thought that this would be so unlimited. Right. And, I would be able to do anything, but I feel just as limited as I did before. And he told me, I bet Bill Gates feels the same way. Right. And I sat with that for a moment. You got Bill Gates there with the entirety of Microsoft, but you also look at the vision of Microsoft, right? And how absolutely massive it is to be one of those massive tech companies. And that made me feel quite a lot better, frankly, because I think he's very right about that.
So to help everyone listening understand Indico's technology and business, maybe talk us through how a typical customer uses the product.
Absolutely. So to talk about intelligent document processing really broadly, I'll just use invoices as an example, right? And invoices, I would say they're probably one of the simplest kinds of documents that Indico processes, but everyone sort of knows what an invoice is, so it's a good example. So traditional invoice offering, right? You kind of get an API off the shelf, right? And sort of the premise of this API is, you pass a PDF in and you get the values out of the invoice that you care about. Now, the problem with these sort of static black box API models generically, right? Because again, that's how we used to sell, is that they are very, very good at very quickly getting you to an 80% kind of solution, right? And with invoices, this is a great example, right? So let's say, OCR, for instance, OCR is going to tell me I've got the number 2 at position 40 by 180, right? What it's not going to tell you is the total value is $180, right? And really, the first I sort of say maybe that's 80% of the problem. I don't know. I'm totally winging it out there, right? But it looks like you're very close to a solution when you look at OCR output. And then you realize, like all problems, or that last 20%, that's actually where 80% of the effort is, right? And kind of that normalization is actually significantly harder than what they've done up front, even though it looks like you've made a lot of progress. And to kind of make things worse, what's really difficult is that when you're buying sort of a static, off the shelf black box sort of API, there's a massive amount of risk in that technology because the underlying models aren't being updated consistently, right? And they're going to get stale, right? They all get stale. And, we saw it on our side, just the huge amount of effort it takes to keep them up to date. And so what we kind of decided to do was, all right, we actually think that model is fundamentally wrong, right? It's just like you're not going to get to success with static black box models, right? And so what we built our platform around, the idea is you say you want to do invoice processing, right? We're not going to say, okay, we've got the one, we're not the invoice experts. We take, a day one perspective that no, you are the invoice expert, right? Or again, for whatever process you're automating, whatever document-based process you're talking about. And what our platform does is it actually puts the power in the hands of the person who's processing the invoices today. So the idea is, they've got some interface where, invoice comes in, they've got to, enter a few data fields. And so the Indico platform, that's kind of the first pane. That's one of our first modules, right? Is where the invoices actually land, right? Where the person actually keys the data in, right? And then obviously you've got an ML model on the back end. And this is where things start to get really, really interesting. That is starting to learn automatically as people do the data entry in a way that, again, it's very much like what they're doing today. But we've got sort of the whole application tooled such that ML can kind of take advantage of every interaction you're making with it. And so after you do, and this is the other kind of key thing, and this is what makes this impractical for so many other folks, and this is why other people don't offer this, is that if I want to let you as one of our customers build a custom ML model, and I want it to have the quality you get with deep learning, you're talking hundreds of thousands of examples. Right, you're talking maybe even millions of examples, right? And when you're talking about processing hundreds of thousands of invoices before you get to a solid model, like I'm sorry, get out of my office is kind of, if I told people that. And so the really cool thing about the Indico platform is because we take advantage of this technology called transfer learning, and there's details to that, and we'll talk more about it in a bit. We actually can allow people to get to these production quality deep learning models with as few as 200 examples. Right. And that's the really, really key thing, right? As you imagine, when you can make your own custom intelligent bots with 200 examples as a non-technical subject matter expert, really, it kind of opens up this world of opportunity. Now, there's a lot of other things in the product as well, right? We're huge believers in explainability and interpretability. So, you get this whole suite of explainability metrics. Again, they're created automatically. You don't have to pre-code that, but it tells you, okay, why did the model make this prediction, right? How reliable is it? How do you test it? All those pieces. And there's more aspects to it, but those are really, really the high levels, right? You come in, you do your process as it is today. Machine intelligence sort of pops up in the background. It starts helping you in sort of this machine assist version, right? Portions are going to start flowing through automatically, right? The whole thing just gets better and better and better with time.
So you got a lot of technical founders listening, and I think they'd probably benefit from hearing about your journey from founding the company as a CEO and then handing over to, for lack of a better term, a professional CEO while you stepped into a CTO role. What was that process? What was that decision-making process like for you?
Absolutely. And I think this is it really speaks to some of the mistakes that I made early on, right? Because I think at the end of the day, I am a CTO. I am really, really good in that role. And when I was founding Indico, I knew that was the role that I was going to be really good at, right? Somewhere in the back of my mind. I think the thing that is difficult, especially for technical co-founders, is that there is this attitude very much that, the CEO is the guy, right? And so, they've got this very, headed by one person kind of mentality. And I just think that it's wrong because what it does is it pushes these CTOs, because the problem I guess really is that a lot of young technical founders, they can do both. Right, like I could do both. Like I was a fine CEO, right? In the grand scheme of things, right? Like I raised plenty of funds, and like the company, stayed alive, and I did much better than a lot of CEOs would do. But I was always going to be a better CTO than I was a CEO. And I let myself get a little bit caught into the ego of it, right, in the first time around. And I think the other thing is just you're getting so much advice from so many different people. And I actually turned to my board one day, pretty soon after we raised our seed round. I actually told them, I said, look, I'm not a CEO. Like, I'm really, really good at the technical side of this, but we should bring someone else in to be the CEO. And I was talking with advisors, and like I felt really, really good about this until they started telling me, oh, you shouldn't feel like this makes you a failure. And to which I'm like, well, I didn't, but now I do. And you get that kind of response from absolutely everyone. And I do think it's also important to be realistic. One of the things that was really important for us when we did eventually go out and bring the CEO, and it was also tied to the Indico V1, V2, right? So sort of a CEO for a developer tools company, right, versus a CTO for an enterprise software company is kind of a natural equivalence there. But it also did go along with that shift, right? As the focus of Indico really was changing. And, it was also really, really important for us that we weren't emphasizing neither, right? What ended up happening for us, right, is, maybe this is a little unfair to me, but I almost feel like Indico didn't have a CEO for the first several years, right? And I was really functionally acting as the CTO. So what we really just did is we just kept developing this tech to an insane degree, right? Like years and years and years, we were focusing on this field that is now very, very popular, sort of transfer learning and NLP. We've been working on that for 7 years. We're already on to the next thing. Most people will tell you that space has existed for maybe 2 years, right? So, I would say those were some of the mistakes, but also, kind of to your original question, it meant that the process of actually bringing in a CEO, it was very much writing the ship, right? And it felt like and I was actually the one that motivated it, right? I think you hear a lot of times where, the investors step in, they're like, oh, you got to bring in absolutely not the case here. Actually, our investors were completely behind us. I think, from their perspective, even if I screwed things up terribly, they always knew the team at Indico was good enough that, they were going to get their money back. I don't know, but honestly, I do think they care quite a lot about founders. This is 406 vendors that I'm talking about. So they're really, really kind of founder centric. So they were very, very behind me. And I actually had to push them and say, hey, look, I think that this is going to work 10 times better if we get a CEO in here and I move over to the CTO role. And then we did a whole executive search. It took a long time, but we got it done. And honestly, I've only done it once and it worked out really, really well for us. I had a lot of friends that did the same thing at the same time, and it didn't work out so well for them. I think that what it comes down to is you have to realize that, bringing a CEO should be, an exercise in making sure that everyone can bring their A game to work, right? And if it's something other than that, I don't think it's going to work out very, very well. But I think that's one of the reasons it worked out so well for us is, the investors and the team and everyone was just fully aligned. And then Tom is also just awesome. He and I work really, really well together. And all things we like paid this recruiter, and then it turns out we've got 10 second degrees of connection, right? But I think that's the other thing, right? Is you can't control for kind of executive chemistry, and just making sure that it's someone you can work with really, really well, and someone you trust is so important.
It takes an egoless co-founder, though, to be able to bring in a new leader and understand that there are going to be decisions that you disagree with, but you deputized him to be your CEO. Talk about some of the challenges, or maybe the darker days when you felt like, man, what did I do? This was my vision, my baby. It's got a new parent.
I'm going to be like very, very happy to say that like I have not had situations like that with Tom. I will completely agree with your first statement, right? It's something that I've got plenty of issues, but one of the things that I'm quite good at is being egoless. Is like I'll defend Indico to death, absolutely, right? But me as an individual, there's a lot of things out there, and I'm not that smart a guy. Just at the end of the day, I don't know that much, and so again, like for me, just the question of like, hey, I need help with this. Like we're missing this piece in the company, right? And it's actually, I will say, it's one of the things that is a very healthy part of the culture at Indico, right? It's something that we've just kind of imbued without is like, yes, we happen to build cutting edge technology, but it's really, really important to everyone there that it's all in service of this end customer. And I think that's the thing is like, I mean, sure. Tom and I, we disagree on, sometimes which feature has to be higher priority than the other, right? But, we've not had any like massive blow up disagreements. I think when we have different points of view, like we chat it through, like we bring folks in and, like we brawl it out and like we beat each other, we bat each other around for a bit. And but we go into that conversation knowing that everyone wants to make Indico better. Right. And honestly, so long as you agree on that stuff, like if someone happens to, I don't even see it as like, I'm not ceding a point. It just turns out that they were right and I was wrong. And that happens all the time. And I have no issue admitting that. Like I'm wrong all the time. And sometimes Tom is right. And it's great that he's there to correct my mistakes sometimes. And sometimes we make mistakes together, right? Sometimes we make that call wrong together and, we flinched a couple of times. And honestly, the only thing I think there is to be done for that kind of feeling is you just have to have this kind of radical bottom up transparency in your organization is, we have to make it so clear to everyone that works at Indico, like we trust you, we desire your opinion. And just as much as if either Tom or I are screwing up, we have to hold each other accountable. We desperately, desperately need everyone at Indico to hold us accountable too. And because we've, I think empowered them and made it clear to them that we really do trust them to do their jobs well, we've really succeeded in that element of our culture.
So you mentioned up at the front of the podcast that you famously acknowledge your skepticism about deep learning. This goes back a ways, right? Maybe 8-9 years. So let's talk about your perspective on the state of AI and specifically, where are we as an AI community in terms of making progress toward AGI, artificial generalized intelligence?
All right. So here's my very controversial AGI point of view. I don't think AGI exists. And I don't mean that as I don't think we've built it yet. I actually think that AGI, it's not even a cohesive concept. I think when most people refer to, I think that the notion of AGI, and actually here, so I think that for most of history, we've been so far away from any notion of AGI, it sort of hasn't mattered. Right. It's like, oh, why are you splitting hairs on, whether the AI has a physical body or not? Right. Like we're so far from that, it doesn't matter. But suddenly that's actually not true anymore. Right. And actually a lot of those pieces suddenly matter when it comes to, what is AGI? And I think that so here's a great example, right? We talked the Turing test, right? And like I think the Turing test is just awful, right? It's unscientific bunk. I mean, Turing is absolutely awesome, but this test, even he disavowed it in his later years, right? This notion that you have a conversation with a computer, and if it can trick you to thinking that it's a human, then it wins, right? And actually, I think one of the big gaps is this notion of human mimicry versus intelligence. And we think of these as very much the same, but I'll give an example, right? Let's say you ask in a conversation, how tall are you? What's your favorite color? Right? Like entirely subjective things. What's the right response to the Turing test? Well, the right response to the Turing test is to basically pick one, right? And be consistent throughout, right? And you realize actually that's a really big problem because it means that what we're testing in a Turing test is not how intelligent this thing is, right? Because the intelligent thing to do would be to understand that you're asking for height and realize I could give any answer, right? It's really about mimicking a specific person. And there's 1,000 different examples of this. But when I think about it, I also think that even if we had a reified notion, I think this notion of AI as a vein to human mimicry, I think it's a waste of time, right? And my view is that we've got plenty of human intelligence, right? We've got it in spades and spades and spades, and the things that humans are good at, we're really, really good at. And actually, it's not a total overlap with the things that machines are good at. So the things that I'm fundamentally a lot more interested in is not how do we build a human to build an AI to be a bot that sits next to a human and does whatever, right? Boring is maybe not the right word. It just feels like the wrong target. I'm a lot more interested in, sometimes we talk about Indico as this bionic arm for the knowledge worker, right? And that's the analogy I much, much prefer is I think about AI as this next wave of automation, right? But when you look at the historic industrial revolutions, right? Some of that is pure automation, right? But the vast, vast, vast majority of what's happening, right, is human-powered tools that are just better, right? It's drill presses, it's precision machinery, right? And I view AI very much through that kind of lens. And then of course the contrary thing is that I think most people would assert that Indico is pushing the boundaries in AGI, and we do spend time very much in the space that people would probably point to and be like, that leads to that. But I see it differently.
I love that phrase, the bionic arm for the knowledge worker. And it's clear that while you gave the example of invoice processing, let's say, the vision is much broader. So let's fast forward 10 or even 15 or 20 years. You look back and, you and the team have changed the world. How is the world different because of what Indico accomplished?
Let's think about document-based processes. And I think just because everyone realizes, I think in the back of their mind, right, organizations process invoices, right? They process insurance claims, right? They process purchase orders and they read contracts, right? They approve loans and they approve mortgages, right? We understand that all of these things happen. What we really don't understand, especially on the consumer side, is exactly what how the sausage is made, right? What happens from that point forward. And here I can't use any names, right? But the processes don't work as well as you think they do. They're not transparent, right? And I think that especially today, and I'll just touch on this briefly so we don't spend a huge amount of time here, right? But we talk about bias in AI, right? What we don't talk about as much is bias in humans. And especially in the unstructured world, right? I think structured data, it's been relatively well ironed out, right? And when you're lending on a row in a database, there's pretty restrictive regulations for what you can and can't do. Certainly those could be better, but unstructured, it is the Wild West out there, right? I mean, from a business process perspective, you talk about black box AI. Humans are this ultimate black box where the level of transparency that a lot of these companies have into these processes are, I dumped a pile of documents on Joe's desk. Joe said they were okay, so we wrote the loan, right? And again, not everyone is that crude, but a lot of people are. Right. And questions about why did we approve this one? Or, hey, we go through the audit and this number was wrong. Right. We had an experience with a mortgage lender where they sent us a whole bunch of, these mortgage packets, and, there's appraisals and home inspections, a whole bunch of stuff like that. And they had their, 13-point checklist for what they needed to check was in the bundle and check, synced up. We went through everything and said, okay, thank you for all the documents. We found that of what you sent us, 7% didn't match your checklist. And suddenly the room goes silent, right? I mean, you can hear a pin drop. They're like, wait, what data did we give them again? Like, that was production data, right? And then what they realize, right, because they have no transparency into these processes. What they realize is that 6 to 7% of all of the reverse mortgages they've been proving didn't meet their own internal standards, right? And this is happening everywhere. Right. So when you talk about, how is Indico changing the world, right? And when we look back, I think that we're fundamentally changing the way that organizations use and think about unstructured data. Right. This notion that contracts should sit in a file folder and, you're going to pay a contracting firm, $10 million to look through a particular risky clause whenever you have to do that. That's just not the way business is going to work going forward, right? We think of it as having three really big pillars. One, obviously, is automation, right? I don't think I need to pitch anyone on automation. That's here. Unstructured automation, just, things like invoice processing, contract, analysis. Everyone gets how useful that is, right? We also have things like analytics. And this is a thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that this data, this unstructured data, it's really trapped. Right? You've got Tableau, you've got all these awesome BI tools, and they are useless when it comes to unstructured data, right? It's like, what is a histogram of this? You get word clouds maybe, and that's really the best that you can do. So I think you think about, really turning unstructured data into structured data and the things that enables, because that's kind of what we're doing at the end of the day. Analytics is another really, really big piece of that. And finally, and this is actually, I think another bolder idea, if you will, is this notion of unstructured applications. The applications today actually, the massive blobs of data you have floating around, right? The huge compute loads, right? These distributed workloads, it's actually very, very different from how you build an e-commerce app, right? And it's something that we're starting to, I mean, honestly, we've been doing this for many years and we're just still starting to understand the full scope of this. But we actually, and we recently open sourced this, we've started building an application development framework, right? Just because the day-to-day problems you run into when you're coding these, modern ML unstructured workflows, they're very different than traditional ones, right? So I would like to tell you, in 10 years when Indico was wildly successful, I went to a pharma conference on data science. And the first thing they started off with was, as everyone knows, the first step in pharma data science is to delete all of your unstructured data. And this is super common. This is basically how data science works everywhere. And it's because unstructured data is so poorly understood and so risky that literally they don't even want to touch it. And you think about all of the value that is trapped in doctors' notes, right? You think of all of the value that is coming in these, local and municipal filings and these research articles, right? That's completely inaccessible today, right? I think we fundamentally look at unstructured data in a different way in 10 years because of Indico.
It's become almost commonplace to cite absurd figures like from McKinsey saying in a decade, 70% of traditional jobs will be replaced by automation. And then you say, you talk about a bionic arm, which frankly, every knowledge worker needs a bionic arm, right? That's, the farthest from automation replacing humans. Where do you sit on that spectrum? And maybe more specifically, what advice do you have for a generation of kids in college, high school, et cetera, that are thinking about what skills they can invest in that will never be automated away?
Yeah, and I would say here, and like you said, right, bionic arm for the knowledge worker, that is really the way that we view it. And I think that when you look traditionally at automation across industries, right, I think it's the same history again and again and again, right, is that, yeah, I honestly, I think the people that are really going to lose out on this next wave of unstructured automation, they're not the knowledge workers, right? Because the knowledge that they've got, right, is actually really, really valuable. It's the people that are doing all of this services scut work right now to like semi-automate these things, right? Because when you look at, you pick off one of these unstructured use cases and you try to solve it with traditional ML, you're selling a $10 million services budget along in with that, right? So I think the people that are they're immediately going to be impacted. Like as ML just becomes more accessible and easier to build, people are not going to have the stomach to do that anymore. That's already started to happen in our space. There's just like so much bad blood. So I think again, I'm very much in what I do think, right? And maybe this is a very different way of viewing it, is that it's not that 70% of jobs are going to be automated. It's that every individual person is going to be doing 4 times more, right? And I think that when people are doing 4 times more, it opens up opportunities fundamentally rather than closing them down, right? So I would say where we see things work really, really well, right? What we're delivering to our customers is, yes, it is automation, right? But we're not cutting headcount. Right? It's like, hey, your contracts team is your bottleneck and they can't do their job because 90% of what they're doing is spent doing a subpar version of this thing that they have to do that they don't even honestly have the time to do right. And so it's like, okay, great. Indico comes in, suddenly they can do their job correctly. They've got an audit trail through it, right? And now instead of taking 90% of the time, it's taking 50% of the time, and they can actually do the work that they need to do. And when the business, grows 2x the next year, they don't need to grow that bottleneck 2x as well, right? So that is really, really the way I think it. I think that knowledge workers are going to continue to be valuable for a very, very long time. I think when young folks are out there looking at which jobs are going to be automated or not, honestly, my best first advice is just that all of the analyses out there on which jobs are at risk for automation, they all suck. They all disagree, right? And they're all written by folks that frankly aren't programmers. Because that's the one thing that is, I just firmly, it's absolutely never going to go away, right? The job market for programmers are like good technical programmers. If you just look at the salaries, it's very clear that not only is desire not going down as automation creeps into that industry, because obviously software development is 1,000 times more automated than it was 50 years ago, right? But it's only increasing because the value of each individual in that space, just like the value of each individual knowledge worker in the future, is going to be so much higher.
Well, Slater, feels like we're just getting started, but we've reached the end of our time for today. There's so many topics I'd like to explore. Maybe if we could, might have to have you back to pick up where we left off. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a lot of fun.
I mean, particularly that last thread about kind of, the future of work. And to your point, just an insatiable global demand for programmers. That's
Absolutely.
topic for a whole other conversation.
That's true. Yeah, we could talk about STEM education there as well.
Well, good. We'll have to do that.
Yeah.
But for now, Slater, we're going to sign off. Thanks for joining me. This has been a lot of fun, and really can see why everyone's so excited about what you and Indico are building.
Oh, thanks. It's been a lot of fun, Dan. Thanks for having me. It's very, very pleasant conversation and great questions.
You bet. Well, this is your host, Dan Turchin, signing off for this week. Back next week with another fascinating guest.